Kia ora tātou, ko Andrew Doubleday tēnei. Welcome to this workshop. It's one of four. And this one's entitled Being Tauiwi in a Tiriti Honouring Church. It's a workshop for Tauiwi by Tauiwi. Now, if this is not the one that you signed up for, you need to get out of this room fairly quickly and go and look for the one that you have. If this is your workshop, welcome, welcome, welcome. We're going to start with a simple video, and then you're going to be led in a discussion, a conversation about how we might move forward. In 1983, the Methodist Church of New Zealand committed itself to becoming a bicultural church, Te Hahiwetiriana or Aotearoa. It did so with a great deal of work having gone in beforehand, with a great deal of enthusiasm, with a great deal of energy, and with a great deal of mahi over the subsequent years, as people continued to teach and to encourage, particularly Tauiwi, in what it meant to be part of a bicultural church, a Tiriti honouring church. We were leaders in the 1980s and 90s. We were leaders within the churches. We were leaders within wider society in this whole area. And I think it's become pretty obvious in the intervening 40 years that there's been a good deal of slippage. We're no longer what we were in so many ways, and certainly in this area. We cannot any longer claim to be leaders in the bicultural journey that we entered into nearly 40 years ago. One of the ways I can say that with confidence is because I'm the president. I'm a president who comes out of a parish ministry with very little understanding or capacity with Te Reo Māori. And that's something that the church needs to be concerned about as well as me. We just need to look at the wider culture and see that as we watch the television, as we listen to the radio and all forms of media, we hear Te Reo spoken with such fluency and with such confidence by ordinary everyday presenters in a way that is providing a lead and indicating that in some way over the last years the world has changed. And we have moved much more towards becoming a Te Tiriti honouring kind of Aotearoa society. I notice it with the more modern churches, those have sprung up over the last decades. Among a number of them, there's a real commitment to being bicultural, to honouring the commitment that was made in 1840 to Te Tiriti, recognising it's part of the context, it's part of the milieu in which we live, and we can't escape it. For us as Methodists, it's hardwired, it's hard-baked into our Wesleyan heritage. Our first missionary, Samuel Lee, came here in 1822. It was in 1840 and leading up to 1840 that Wesleyan missionaries were busy in translation work, busy in encouraging Māori chiefs to sign Te Tiriti. So we're part of it. We can't avoid it, even if we wanted to. It's part of who we are. It's part of our whakapapa. It's part of our DNA. We cannot escape it, even if we wanted to. We are bound in Te Tiriti because of its covenantal nature. Now, as a Christian church, presumably we take Scripture and the examples and models that it gives us seriously. And I owe thanks to the Reverend Gary Clover for insight that he shared on the nature of covenant with relation to this as we find it, particularly in the Old Testament. There's a story that we find that spans over hundreds of years. It starts in the book of Joshua and comes to a conclusion in 1 Samuel. It starts with a people called the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites are a sub-tribe of the Amorites. And as Israel is coming up out of its desert wanderings into the land of Canaan, one of the first people it encounters is the Gibeonites. the Gibeonites enter into a treaty with Israel, a kind of covenant, just like Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And as a result of that treaty, the Gibeonites lived with Israel, lived among them for hundreds of years. It was towards the end of the reign of Saul, Israel's first king, where he must have had a rush of blood to his head and decided that he was going to purify Israel and that he was going to make God happy by wiping out the Gibeonites. He tried. My hunch is he died partway through the venture, and his successor David inherited a situation where he discovered that Israel was in drought and had been for 3 years. When he goes to inquire of the Lord, I presume he uses the priestly method, he discovers that it's on account of the Gibeonites. The answer was clear and unequivocal. It was on account of the Gibeonites. And when he inquires further, discovered that this genocide which was being engaged in contravention to this covenant, to this treaty that had been entered into hundreds of years before, was of deep offence to God. He speaks to the remaining Gibeonite leaders and asks what is required for redress. They tell him. He makes it happen, and it rains. All is able to move forward again in a healthy and life-giving way. It's the nature of the covenant that, in a sense, we've entered into. We can't skip it, we can't avoid it, we can't just simply forget it. We need to do our part in order to honour the God who actually called us into it. We as Methodists also have a long history of covenant. We have a covenant service, if we're doing it right, at the beginning of each year, where we commit ourselves afresh to God, to one another, and to God's purposes for us. As I said, we can't duck away. If we're to live with integrity and relevance into this third decade of the 21st century, and I want to suggest also to live under God's blessing, this is a ball that we need to pick up again. This is one that we need to take seriously. That honouring Te Tiriti is part of the commitment that we as Te Hāhi Weteriana, as Tauiwi within Te Hāhi Weteriana, need to take seriously. The question for us today is, how are we going to do that? What are we going to do that's going to give renewed sense of effect in a life-giving way for the whole of Te Hāhi, for Tauiwi itself, where we recognise the strength and the joy of being involved in this enriching bicultural relationship, this treaty honouring church? How are we going to do that as we move forward?